The Sydney rental market is brutal. That's what everyone kept telling me when I first moved here from Perth, but I didn't truly understand until I spent 3 months couch surfing between various friends' places while desperately hunting for anything within my budget. My new job at the museum paid decently, but apparently not well enough to afford my own place in any of the decent suburbs. That's why, when I stumbled across the listing for a dirt-cheap ground-floor flat in Newtown, I jumped at the chance. Sure, the building was old, and the photos showed some wear and tear, but the price was less than half what similar places were going for. I figured there had to be a catch, but I was desperate enough not to care. The property manager, Ms. Lisa, seemed oddly eager to show me the place. When I arrived for the inspection, she was already waiting outside the building. She kept checking her phone and glancing around nervously as she led me inside.
Previous tenant left, suddenly.
She explained, fumbling with the keys.
Very suddenly. Left everything behind. We're including the furniture in the lease, no extra charge.
That should have been my first warning sign. The second should have been the way she wouldn't step more than a few feet into the flat, hovering anxiously by the door as I looked around. The space was surprisingly large for an old building, a proper one-bedroom with high ceilings and beautiful original hardwood floors. The previous tenant had decent taste too. The furniture was all vintage pieces that perfectly matched the building's era, an elegant wooden dining set, a plush velvet sofa, even one of those old-fashioned vanities with a triple mirror in the bedroom. What happened to the previous tenant? I asked, running my hand along the smooth wood of the dining table. Ms. Lisa's face tightened.
Family emergency overseas. Very sudden. Had to leave everything.
She thrust a stack of papers at me.
Lease agreement. Sign today, move in tomorrow if you want.
I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why she was so eager to rent it out. Should have been suspicious of the price and the included furniture and the way she practically ran out of there once I'd signed. But I didn't. I was just thrilled to finally have my own place. The first few days were perfect. I arranged my belongings among the previous tenant's abandoned furniture, settled into a routine, and started to feel at home. The flat had beautiful natural light during the day, and while the building creaked and settled at night, that was normal for its age. It wasn't until the end of my first week that things started to feel off. I first noticed it when I came home from work one evening. All the mirrors in the flat, and there were quite a few, seemed slightly askew. Not dramatically so, just tilted a few degrees from where they had been. I distinctly remembered straightening them when I moved in, making sure they were perfectly level. I fixed them, assuming it was just the building settling. But the next day, they were crooked again. And the day after that. Always by the same few degrees, always in the same direction. Then I started noticing other things. The furniture would be ever so slightly out of place when I got home. The dining chairs pulled out an inch or two, the sofa cushions slightly rumpled as if someone had been sitting there. Once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the bedroom while I was in the shower, but when I checked, there was no one there. The breaking point came when I woke up one night to find all the mirrors in the flat had been turned to face the wall. I got up, heart pounding, and began turning them back. As I reached for the vanity mirror in the bedroom, movement caught my eye, but not my own reflection. For just a split second, I saw someone else in the glass. A woman with long, dark hair, wearing what looked like a nightgown from another era. When I spun around, the bedroom was empty. That's when the whispering started. It started as a faint murmur, barely audible, like someone talking in the next room. But there was no next room, just the solid brick wall separating my flat from the building next door. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I called Ms. Lisa the next morning, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked about the previous tenant. "I just want to know more about who lived here before me," I said. Did they leave any contact information? There was a long pause before she answered.
No contact. No information. Very private person. Look, I'm busy right now.
She hung up before I could ask anything else. That evening, I decided to talk to my neighbors. The elderly couple upstairs, the Harrises, had lived in the building for 40 years. Mrs. Harris went pale when I mentioned my flat.
"Oh, you're in 1B.
She said, clutching her cardigan.
That was Eleanor's place. Lovely girl, kept to herself mostly. Always wearing those vintage dresses. She worked as a costume designer for the theater, you see."
What happened to her? I asked. Mr. Harris shook his head.
Nobody knows for sure. She just vanished about 6 months ago. Police came, but they couldn't find anything suspicious. All her things were still there, with no signs of forced entry. It was like she just walked out one day and never came back.
The mirrors.
Mrs. Harris added suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper.
She was obsessed with mirrors, kept bringing more and more into the flat, said she needed them for her work, but
She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. But what?
sometimes, late at night, we'd hear her talking, having entire conversations. But when we saw her in the hallway, she was always alone.
I felt a chill run down my spine. Did she ever say anything about the flat? About strange things happening?
Only near the end.
Mr. Harris said.
She started saying she was seeing things in the mirrors, things that couldn't be there. Then one day, she knocked on our door at 3 a.m., absolutely hysterical. Said there was someone else in her flat, someone who looked exactly like her but wasn't her. We called the police, but they found nothing. That was the last time anyone saw her.
I thanked them and returned to my flat, my mind racing. As I closed the door behind me, I heard it. That whisper again, closer now. A woman's voice, speaking in an urgent undertone.
"They're coming through.
It seemed to say.
They're using the mirrors to come through."
I spun around, but the flat was empty. Empty, except for my reflection in the mirrors. My reflection that moved a fraction of a second too late. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every shadow on the wall seemed menacing. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of high heels clicking on the hardwood floors. Moving from the living room to the bedroom, getting closer. I lay frozen in my bed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, this would all be some sort of nightmare. The door creaked open.
"Hello, darling."
The voice was right next to my ear. My eyes snapped open. Standing beside my bed was a woman in a vintage 1930s evening gown, her dark hair styled in perfect finger waves. She might have been beautiful if it hadn't been for her eyes. They were completely white, like marbles, and seemed to glow faintly in the darkness.
"You're living in my flat."
She said, her voice echoing strangely, as if speaking from the bottom of a well.
"But that's all right. We can share."
I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the door. The woman, Eleanor, it had to be Eleanor, didn't move. She just turned her head to follow my movement, her neck rotating far beyond what should have been physically possible.
"Don't be scared."
She said, smiling. Her teeth gleamed metallically in the darkness.
"They said I could keep one, and I choose you."
I ran. Through the bedroom door, down the hallway toward the front door. But when I reached for the handle, my reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye. It wasn't moving with me. Instead, it was standing perfectly still, watching me with those same white eyes. I looked away, yanking at the door handle. It wouldn't budge.
"We can't let you leave.
Eleanor's voice came from behind me.
Not when they're so close to coming through."
Who? I managed to ask, still struggling with the door. Who's coming through?
The others,
she said, as if it should have been obvious.
the ones who live on the other side of the glass. They've been trying to cross over for so long. All they needed was the right mirrors, arranged in the right way. That's why they chose me. I had an eye for patterns, for arrangements, but I failed them. I wasn't strong enough to complete the ritual.
I turned around slowly. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the living room, but something was wrong with her form. Her edges seemed to blur and shift like a reflection in rippling water. Behind her, I could see other shapes moving in the mirrors, dark figures that weren't quite human.
But you,
She continued, taking a step toward me.
you're perfect. You have the right energy. Together, we can finish what I started.
That's when I noticed something terrifying. The mirrors weren't just reflecting the room anymore. They seemed to be showing different spaces entirely, dark places filled with moving shadows. And those shadows were getting closer to the surface of the glass, pressing against it like a membrane. "Stop," I pleaded. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." Eleanor laughed, the sound like breaking glass.
It's already too late. Look.
She gestured to the vanity mirror, and I watched in horror as a hand pressed through the surface of the glass, a hand with too many joints, fingers bent at impossible angles. It was followed by another and another.
They're coming.
Eleanor whispered gleefully.
They're finally coming through.
I had to do something, had to stop this. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. That's when I noticed something odd about Eleanor's reflection, or rather, her lack of one. Even as she stood in front of the mirrors, they showed only the dark figures trying to push through. A thought struck me, a desperate, crazy thought. I ran to the kitchen, Eleanor's laughter following me. Yanking open drawers, I finally found what I was looking for, a hammer in the utility drawer. Without hesitation, I ran back to the living room and swung it at the nearest mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like a scream. The effect was instantaneous. Eleanor's form flickered like a bad television signal, and an inhuman shriek filled the air. The dark figures in the other mirrors recoiled, their limbs twisting in unnatural ways as they retreated from the glass.
No.
Eleanor's voice distorted, becoming multiple voices speaking at once.
Do you have any idea what you've done?
I didn't stop to answer. I swung the hammer again and again, moving from mirror to mirror. Each impact sent shockwaves through the flat, and with each shattered mirror, Eleanor's form became less stable. Her elegant dress began to unravel, revealing something underneath that made my stomach turn. A writhing mass of shadows and reflective surfaces, like broken mirror shards arranged in the shape of a person. But I wasn't fast enough. Before I could reach the vanity mirror in the bedroom, 3 of the dark figures had already pushed halfway through. Their bodies were wrong, like someone had taken human forms and rearranged all the parts. They moved in a jerky, unsettling way, as if they weren't used to existing in 3-dimensional space.
They're going to remake this world.
Eleanor said, her voice now coming from everywhere at once.
Make it like theirs. A world of endless reflections where nothing is quite real, and you could have been part of it.
The first of the creatures pulled itself fully through the mirror. Its skin was like polished obsidian, reflecting distorted versions of the room around it. Its face was smooth, except for a jagged crack where a mouth should be. When it moved toward me, its footsteps left small pools of what looked like liquid mercury on the floor. I backed away, still clutching the hammer. The other 2 creatures were almost through now, their bodies contorting as they squeezed through the mirror's surface. Behind them, I could see more shapes moving in the darkness, pressing forward eagerly. Eleanor's fragmented form drifted between me and the bedroom door.
We could have been sisters.
She said, her face splitting into multiple overlapping versions of itself.
I would have shown you such beautiful things. The geometries on the other side, the endless halls of mirrors, the reflections that go on forever.
As she spoke, the walls of the flat seemed to ripple and shift, like everything was being seen through water. The furniture began to duplicate itself, creating impossible copies that overlapped and merged with each other. Reality itself seemed to be breaking down. The obsidian creature reached for me with hands that kept changing shape, sometimes human-like, sometimes more like curved blades of glass. I swung the hammer at it, but it passed right through, like trying to hit a reflection. That's when I noticed something crucial. The creature cast no shadow, just like Eleanor. And unlike the normal objects in the room, it wasn't reflected in the fragments of the mirrors I'd already broken. An idea formed in my mind, a desperate, terrifying idea. I dove past Eleanor's shifting form, past the reaching hands of the mirror creatures, and into the bedroom. The vanity mirror still stood intact, its surface now like a window into a dark world of twisted reflections. The others were still pushing through, their bodies distorting the glass like it was made of rubber. But I wasn't aiming for them. Instead, I turned to face the mirror and raised the hammer high.
"Stop!"
Eleanor screamed, her voice shattering the light bulbs throughout the flat.
"If you break that one, you'll destroy everything."
"Good," I said, and swung the hammer directly at my own reflection. The impact felt like an explosion. The mirror didn't just break, it imploded, pulling inward like a collapsing star. A vacuum force filled the room, and I could feel myself being pulled toward the fractured glass. The creatures screeched, their bodies elongating as they were sucked back toward the mirror's surface. Eleanor's form began to disintegrate, pieces of her being pulled into the vortex.
"You don't understand.
She wailed, her voice growing distant.
They'll just find someone else. Another flat, another person. We're everywhere, in every reflection."
The force of the implosion grew stronger, and I had to grab onto the doorframe to keep from being pulled in. The obsidian creatures were dragged across the floor, their bodies shattering into countless reflective shards as they disappeared into the void. Eleanor's fragmented form spiraled into the mirror like smoke being sucked into a drain, her final scream echoing endlessly. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The bowl stopped, and the remaining mirror fragments fell to the floor with a musical tinkling sound. The flat was plunged into darkness. I stood there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When I finally found the courage to check my phone for the time, I saw it was only 3:33 a.m. The entire ordeal had lasted less than an hour. In the dim light of my phone, I could see the devastation. Every mirror in the flat was destroyed, their fragments scattered across the floor like fallen stars. The vintage furniture had been twisted and warped, some pieces fused together in impossible ways. The walls were covered in a thin film that looked like mercury, but evaporated when touched. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my car, waiting for sunrise. When morning finally came, I went straight to Ms. Lisa's office. She took one look at my face and sighed.
It happened again, didn't it?
She asked, pulling out a form from her desk drawer. The paper was worn, like it had been handled many times.
You're the fourth one this year.
You knew, I said. It wasn't a question. You knew about Eleanor, about the mirrors, about all of it. She nodded slowly.
This building's been here since the 1930s. The problems started during World War II. Something about the bombing raids, they said, weakened the barriers between here and somewhere else. That flat's always been the worst. We try to keep it rented. It seems to help contain things. When it's empty too long, they start spreading to other flats.
She slid the form across the desk. It was a lease termination agreement, already filled out with my details.
No penalty for breaking the lease. We'll even help with moving costs. Just don't talk about it, okay? Insurance doesn't cover interdimensional damage.
I signed the form without reading it. As I stood to leave, she caught my arm.
One more thing.
She said, her voice low.
Get rid of all your mirrors, every single one, and maybe stay away from reflective surfaces for a while. Sometimes they leave traces, ways to find their way back.
I've followed her advice. I've moved to a small town in the outback where there's not much call for mirrors or shiny surfaces. I've covered every window in my new place with thick curtains, and I only go out during the day when reflections are harder to see. But sometimes, late at night, I catch movement in the corner of my eye, in a glass of water, in the screen of my phone, in the chrome kettle I forgot to put away. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear whispers calling my name, speaking in Eleanor's voice. But that's not what truly terrifies me. What keeps me awake at night is the memory of Eleanor's last words. They'll just find someone else. You see, I did some research after I moved, looked into the building's history into Eleanor's disappearance, and I found something disturbing. Every few months in different parts of Sydney, people vanish without a trace. Their homes are always found undisturbed, except for one detail. All the mirrors are arranged in exactly the same pattern. And the strangest thing, in the weeks before each disappearance, witnesses report seeing the same thing. A woman in a vintage dress, with long dark hair and white marble-like eyes, carrying an antique mirror into the building. But she's not alone anymore. Now sometimes, people see someone else with her, a figure that looks almost exactly like me. So if you're house hunting in Sydney and you find a place that seems too good to be true, check the mirrors. Count them. And if you see a woman in vintage clothes or someone who looks like they might be me, run. Run, and don't look back. Because your reflection might not be your own.